Hi, I'm James McGuire, and today we're talking about how organizations use data analytics, how they can use them better. We'll also look to the future of data analytics. To discuss that, I'm joined by four major thought leaders. With me is Miles Sewer, Head of Global Enterprise Marketing at Dell Boomi. Hello to you, Miles.
Hello there.
Also with us is Tom Davenport, Professor of IT and Management at Babson College. Hello to you, Tom.
Howdy.
And I spied on your LinkedIn page, correct me if I'm wrong, you're also a visiting professor at Oxford University this semester?
Yes, a virtual visiting professor. They said, you can come and join us here, but we're not in the office, so you might as well stay where you are. So.
Okay. They're keeping you busy.
That's not any fun.
Also with us is Marco Ian City, professor at the Harvard Business School, Chair of Technology. Hello to you, Marco.
Hello.
And rounding out our panel is Dion Hinchcliffe, Principal Analyst at Constellation Research, one of my all-time favorite research firms. Hello to you, Dion.
Hello, James. Great to be here.
Hey. So before we talk about data analytics, I want to thank the people who are viewing and listening. Thanks for joining us. We do welcome your questions. Ask your question at any time. There's a Q&A box down there at the bottom of the screen. This is the internet. We can be interactive. So we'll do our best to get to them. All right, so data analytics, let's get sort of a level set. Where are we at in terms of companies succeeding or failing with data analytics? Is it really working out there? Miles, what's your take? And in particular, what about the predictive analytics models that presume to glimpse into the future, leveraging AI and ML? Is that really working for companies?
It really depends. I mean, MIT CISR did some research a while back, and one of the things they discovered that I thought was fascinating was that only 28% of companies were really ready to transform. 51% were still in silos. So, the way Tom thinks about it, they're doing departmental analytics. And 21% were, doing things that were duct tape and Band-Aid. So, it's really interesting. In terms of the use of AI and ML, it's quite interesting. I mean, there are companies, like Stitch Fix who are doing kind of amazing things for consumers. But there's even people like Nordstrom who've managed to connect their supply chain and their purchase data and actually predict what you want. And I don't even have that on Amazon. So there are companies that are succeeding, but I'd love to hear what Tom and others have to say on this topic as well.
Tom, I know you wrote a book called Analytics at Work, and you proposed a maturity model. What would you say in terms of how are organizations doing in your maturity model?
Well, I can answer that question with a lot of precision, perhaps more than is warranted. But I also co-founded a company. This is a smaller company than the one that Marco co-founded, but the International Institute for Analytics does benchmarking of analytics maturity across organizations. And so God had decreed that all maturity models should have 5 levels. And so I complied with that. And level 1 is really screwed up, and level 5 is really sophisticated. Sadly, the average across all companies assessed, and I think there are over 225 so far, is with double-digit precision, 2.25.
Okay.
So somewhere in the kind of localized analytics space that Miles was talking about. So Miles, I have empirical confirmation of your hypothesis there. The highest ever, I think it was AWS. Sorry, Marco, I know you like another company better generally, but Amazon was 4.94, and the lowest ever was 1.73. So no, 1.25 among companies assessed. Market leaders go up to 4.94, and the lowest is 1.73.
Well, the 2.2 figure suggests the companies aren't really doing too well. They're sort of middling at best.
They are. It means that they have pockets here and there of some interesting activity, but it's not coordinated. It's not considered a strategic resource by the senior management team. Typically, in cases like that, no chief analytics officer or anything along those lines.
So Marco, do you agree? It sounds like companies are still opening up a fortune cookie to decide where they should go to.
Well,
they're not looking at it all. Yeah, please.
It's a moving target, right? It's a rapidly moving target, we've looked at this as well, and as we look across different organizations, you can see like there really is huge variety, right? So there's still a bunch that are living in the past. I mean, I think probably at the 1.01 Davenport scale, I think you probably have the Harvard Business School, so I think we are very good at defining the bottom of any.
I sense you have tenure, Marco, based on that comment.
That's what tenure is for. That's what tenure is for. We can say things, so it's good. And but it's it's true. But there's a bunch of different organizations that actually have done a lot, and my sense also depends a fair amount on the industry that you are in, right? So I totally second Tom's sort of analytics on AWS. I mean, Amazon is amazing in what they do and how they've done it, both across AWS and retail. In fact, I think that they're incredibly advanced. But even some more traditional companies, like if you look at someone like Amex, for example, they've done a lot. Or if you look
for
at
a long time.
Yeah.
For a long time, right? Yeah.
For a long time. Or, sort of the credit card companies that sort of have had to get their act together in some ways. And they tend to be fairly advanced at a bit different stages. People in financial services, if they don't actually invest in this, they know that they're essentially out of business pretty quickly. More traditional CPG companies, it's like a Kraft Heinz or someone like that, is not going to be, you're not going to find them as far along. But again, one of the things that's really interesting is that it's accelerated. Like what was, in January, February, everything changed, right? So in March, when everybody went home and virtualized, all of a sudden, like there is such a drive to digitize everything that you possibly can that I think is having quite an impact on the company's capabilities in, sort of their sophistication at data platform level analytics and so forth. And so one of the interesting things is the pandemic, hopefully at some point stabilizes a little bit. Companies will have to decide whether they're going to sustain all these changes or not. But for now, they're changing, and that's for sure.
Diane, give us a ray of optimism that companies really are far ahead with data analytics, and also, I mean, have you seen the accelerating changes based on COVID?
So I do a lot of surveys of CIOs and what are the top issues, and for a couple of years now, analytics has been high in the top 5 of priorities in terms of fielding it. I just did another CIO survey. It's number 2, right? Digital transformation is number 1. Analytics is number 2 in terms of priority. So it's just gotten just a little bit higher. But it's like all powerful technologies. Analytics separates the leaders from the laggards, and we see it. Most organizations are just in the developing phase. And where they normally get stuck is in operationalizing all these insights. So they quickly get buried by the tools. They don't know what to do with these drawers and drawers full of dashboards and reports. They don't know what to do with all that data, and they don't have the capacity to do anything if they did want to do something about it. So this is where most are stuck in that big gap where they need what's called, often called analytics ops, to operationalize that and actually make more use of that data, connect it to what they're actually doing. And that's where most organizations, quite frankly, are stuck.
Why do they not have the capacity to do anything about it, given how important it is?
Because there's too much data. They're not used to having that reflexive function. Most of the time they use it as inputs to strategy or to make a point decision. They don't actually feed it into all the different operational opportunities that they could have. Say, here's all our unhappy customers. Let's go do something about that. Here's all the advertising spots that we could make the most out of. So, so those are the big challenges.
Well, let's dig more into the challenges, and I'm hearing perhaps one of the challenges might be companies need to hire more data scientists and give them more power. Of course, that's a very expensive thing to do. Marco, in one of your writings, you talked about the issue of data platforms and data pipelines, and it's one of the things that companies struggle with architecting them. What is the problem here?
Well, I think that the challenge is that I think we're moved beyond sort of the challenge for every company to go in and do a little bit of analytics, like to go out there and say, let's do one prediction model, let's do something, one little tiny thing, but do it well. maybe bring in consultants to do it for us, and we'll be just fine. I think right now we're in the model that we're in the mode that to do things well, you're going to do things at scale, and you do things across a whole variety of different processes. So it's not about building sort of one cool algorithm to do some prediction in marketing. It's fundamentally about doing hundreds of these algorithms. Like I was talking to somebody at Fidelity, for example, they have something like 120 different project leaders that are dedicated to deploying essentially, sort of digitally enabled processes at scale. So in order to do that, you need to have a foundation that is designed to do this. In other words, you have some way to kind of bring data in a more industrialized fashion. You can't be just every time you try to solve a problem, you want to bring in a data set and you want to clean the data set and maybe normalize it. If you want to do this at scale, so the data engineering function is becoming really important. So hiring analysts, the data analytics people is not enough. You actually have to have data engineers to go out there and build the kinds of industrialized data pipeline that an organization, say the size of a JP Morgan or an Amex, needs to actually go and deploy these algorithms at scale.
Right.
And so that's becoming, in my view, the bottleneck. It's also one reason why it's so difficult to do it. Back to Dion's question before, is that this is an organizational change, right? So a data platform is not only a technology piece or a technology innovation, it needs to cut across traditional silos to work well, right? You don't want to have everybody with a different version of truth, and you cannot do that anymore. Tom and I wrote this case on P&G a few years back. And one of the big things that P&G was doing back in those days is really get a lot of coherence around, okay, we want to have a single version of truth for any number across the entire firm. And those kinds of things are essential to make a data platform work. You don't want to have 15 different definitions of profit, right? But at the same time, organizationally, they're incredibly challenging. Like imagine at P&G, every brand manager wants control over his or her own data so that they can control how they're evaluated at the end of the year. And so the whole idea of trusting an organization to centralize all that, that's a huge power shift in how the organization works. And I think that's where a lot of the pushback is coming from.
Dan, what do you see in terms of challenges out there? What are companies really falling down on to try to making the most out of their data analytics programs?
Well, I think as Marco mentioned, the organizational changes aren't really fully understood or appreciated to getting the right staff. You were talking, your reaction initially was, let's get some data scientists. But you really need to operationalize that and have staff that can actually say, let's connect this to the flows in our business across our whole value chain. So make sure that sales and marketing and operations, customer service, R&D, all have the insights that we have, right? So, that's the dream of AI. I once had a CIO tell me, my dream is to be able to take everything that we know and make decisions better and faster than our competitors, right? If I can deliver that to the table, I can ride that forever. So that's what we really want to do. But in order to make that happen, we have to shift our organizations to be really analytics focused at an operational level. And that, as I mentioned, is one of the biggest gaps. The other one is talent. I'm hearing consistently that it just isn't there, and they're having to mint their own. That send them to Coursera and take their new data science academy to get to build up that talent, and that's creating gaps for things that they should be doing today. So that's pushing everything down the road. And so I think talent's probably the other big piece. I still think on the machine learning side, there's still a lot of block and tackle to be done on the platforms as well. But the big issues are mostly human.
Yeah, I'm definitely hearing the lack of talent picture. I was talking to one executive a couple of weeks ago, just in terms of looking for AI talent, which is probably more scarce even than data analytics talent. And he said there's one individual who's actually making $1 million a year, a senior AI individual. So hiring the people can be expensive, and of course they have a lot of other job offers. Miles, what do you see in terms of challenges, and why are companies struggling so much with data analytics?
Well, it's interesting because, when I was at HP Software to build a platform that we actually sold to customers, and it took off them, IT leaders, a scorecard and things like that. And one of the things I think reasons it took off was because we built the entire platform from end to end. We had the data pipelines, we fixed the data, and then we presented the data either in a predictive analytical form or something else. I think the same thing exists here. I mean, I think what we did is we said, you know, and that's why I love Marco's concept of pipelines and a platform. What's happened in the legacy software world is we've required the companies to build their platform themselves. They bought this product over here and this product over here, and then they had the job of assembling it. And most stumbled along the way, and projects became narrower and narrower. So I think the big issue is that we need the data scientists, but before we need the data scientists, as Marco has implied, we need the data engineers, or we need to somehow acquire something that allows you to go from the initial stage of the data pipeline to clean and pristine data. One other thought, and I'd love Marco and Tom's thoughts on this as well. I think the data scientists that are becoming established are flipping the model. It used to be, you know, I think back to the product I talked about earlier, we'd ETL the data in and then we try and build reports and things from it. Now, I think data scientists are saying is, let me go discover the data that's out there, do some testing and prepping of that data, and then I'll bring the data over. So are you seeing that, Tom? Is that kind of your perspective? It's almost flipping the model a little bit?
Well, I think with data lakes, you don't have to ETL it anymore. So I think people find data and they say, throw it in the data lake, and then it may never be found again thereafter. But
a data swamp.
You know, at least you don't have to do a lot of work to get it in, and that work isn't wasted. And I agree with what all of you have been saying, but maybe to emphasize something that Dion had said a little bit, I think we certainly need data platforms, but we also need kind of workflow and decisioning platforms, because I don't know, asking people to have a separate step for making their work intelligent doesn't seem to be successful. You've got to just really make it easy. So, you know, if I'm a salesperson and I am trying to decide, well, who do I call on today to sell my products and services, you can just pick somebody at random, or you can say, oh, okay, we're using Salesforce, and my boss has kindly bought this Einstein product that gives me a predictive lead scoring model, and gee, why wouldn't I choose the most likely company to buy my product on a list that's been prepared for me? It's just too easy to ignore. And I think in more and more cases, we're going to have to embed analytics and AI into these transactional and decisioning platforms if we're going to get them to be used successfully.
I think that's totally right. And I think, you know, one of the skill sets, I think, in fact, that is most needed right now and most rare is almost a product management skill set to do that. In other words, you know, who is going to be the person that figures out the linkage between the use case that the sales person may be experiencing and you know, the treasure trove of data that we might have stashed up in the data lake, and you know, how do we pull this all together? How do we bring the right AI expertise to actually define what algorithms we might need to deploy and package it all together into something that you can experiment with, throw it on the platform, make sure that it really works, and then deploy it at scale. And that's a product management function. And so I find it's kind of like it's a bit of a deja vu moment. I don't know, like, you know, many of us were around back in the days when we were doing a lot of product development work, right? And back in the 90s, there was a huge amount of work on product development stuff, and really the emergence of the product management role, right? So the heavyweights, you know, who's going to go out there and pull all the stuff together into a cohesive offering, cohesive product for the customer. Right now, I think product management is shifting over to something that you need to actually get analytics to drive value. So it's really the kind of skill set, the kind of integrative skill set that understands the business need on one side, understand the technology potential on the other side, and pulls those two things together, runs the project, gets it deployed at scale, and then moves on to the next one. That's where I'm seeing the biggest bottleneck in expertise right now.
Mm-hmm.
So one question to kind of redirect it, both Marco and Dion. Marco, in your book, you kind of imply that it's not just the analytic, which is the output, there's kind of I'm going to call it a low code experience level. And Diane, you've been writing a lot about that as well. Connecting the two of you on this discussion would be interesting. We have to turn the data into action, right?
Well, you do, and I would say there's a democratization component. One of the reasons Google was so successful in helping people find information is that anybody could do it. Anybody, right? It was only one place to type. And analytics has to be democratized. Data science has to be democratized to the level that we can, right? It still requires some basic understanding of the numbers and the insights you're going after. But we need to broaden the access so that the most number of people in the organization can serve themselves and gain access to the value in their data and be able to unlock that and put that to the service of the business. And we will have folks that are real experts doing the hard stuff, but everyone needs to be able to benefit from that. So I believe in opening the access, making sure that we safely open up the data across the organization. We have some governance to make sure it's not being misused or used improperly. So we do have consistency, but that key component here is making that really open and accessible.
I could not agree with you more. There is too much opportunity here to just have sort of a focused IT group or a focused analytics group, wherever it sits, to do all the work, right? To drive this. You need to sort of enable people to go out there and do it. Make sure you have the right tool set to do it. Make sure if there's nothing off the shelf that will do it, that you invest in building it. And if you look at a real digital native company, that's a lot of what they do, right? So it's interesting. They spend a lot of time building tools to enable everyone to be more productive. That's why Facebook, you got, people building stuff like React. That's why you have, people at Google building stuff called TensorFlow, and then you go out there and open sources to everybody, right? But the actual idea of building productivity tools to enable, ideally, anyone that has an interest in the right kind of mindset to go off there and build cool stuff that they can use to scale the organization and to digitize it. I think it's how it's done. It's how you break the bottlenecks in kind of making that work. Satya Nadella talks about this a lot, actually, and I know I'll drive Tom crazy in talking about Microsoft, but he loves to talk about it. Because right now they do happen to be have a larger cloud business than Tom's favorite company, but
You think so? Azure is
well,
bigger than AWS?
if you had SaaS and
right. If you had SaaS, Azure is bigger. That's true.
Yeah. Yep. So yeah. I mean, you gotta try. You gotta try to make it happen. But Satya calls us citizen developers, and he drives a lot of people crazy at Microsoft because there's a lot of developer tools that are pretty sophisticated. But he's out there saying everybody should be able to actually go out there and deploy this stuff.
Mm-hmm. We've talked something about best practices and competitive advantage. I want to look to the future. I also have a personal rule. Whenever I talk about data analytics these days, I feel like I need to bring up the idea of Snowflake. Snowflake, as we know, is a cloud-based data warehousing company. It just went public. The fascinating thing about that is Warren Buffett actually invested in that. He's never invested in an IPO in his entire life, which points out to me the absolute primacy of data in the world. Pretty amazing. And of course, Snowflake will work with Azure or Google or AWS. So there's a serious need for data, as shown by the success of Snowflake. On that rambling note, what about the future? What are we, if we have this conversation in the year 2025, we're talking about data analytics. Diane, what will we be talking about in several years down the road? And well, nobody's got ready for it now. Really I
think that most organizations are still working on, they're in an emerging state. And they're still having big challenges getting the data from wherever it is to wherever it needs to be, right? So we have a lot of sclerosis in most organizations, and data ownership is a problem. Data access is an issue. It's still too siloed. Our data foundations are not in good shape, and I think we're now seeing the rise of things like customer data platforms and other solutions that are allowing organizations to systematize, to make data consistent, to make it shareable. Because we're seeing a lot of underutilization of one of the most valuable and irreplaceable assets in our organizations, which is data, right? And so I think we'll see basic progress so that we have stronger open data foundations. and that we'll also have more skill level in our organization. We're going to have much more sophisticated workers in 5 years. They'll have a lot of experience with these now open data platforms with analytics tools. They're not going to be doing everything in Excel anymore. They're going to be using the next generation of analytics platforms like Snowflake. And so we'll probably see that human dimension addressed. I'm still worried about the operational component, but I believe we'll see a lot more analytics ops teams. They actually say driving this value into a feedback loop into the organization. So there's this virtuous cycle. We're actually doing something with all these insights instead of just letting them sit there and admiring them. So we'll see a lot of improvements, but I don't think most organizations won't reach the transformative level in 5 years. I think this is more of a 10-year journey to really get there and to really have that data science, data-driven mindset deep in the culture of most organizations. Some will be there, but I think that's where we'll be.
Tom, what do you see when you look into your crystal ball? And is there a way for you to work in Snowflake to your comment? If not, that's okay. You do get 5,000 bonus points for that. But
Well,
what do you see in the future of data analytics?
Just a quick word about Snowflake.
Please.
It's amazing to me that people talk about them as kind of a analytics and AI company when they're basically a data warehouse in the cloud company. Although the feeling seems to be that they made so much money in their IPO, they can afford to buy whatever other capabilities they need to become a broad data platform company. But I'm not sure they're there yet, and that it'll be quite as easy as people say. But all I know is I did some speaking for them a few years ago, and I just wish I'd been paid in stock. That's all.
Really, seriously, yes. Good thinking.
In terms of what's happening in the future, I think more use of external data. We have for decades been primarily focused on internal data. If we want to know what's happening in the world and with people who aren't our customers yet and so on, we got to get more external. I think there will be much more availability of external data. You already see some change there. Ironically, maybe a move back to smaller data and smaller models than we have now. There is, I think, in this latest AI system called GPT-3 for language creation, 175 billion neuron nodes in this deep learning model. It's kind of gone a little too far, one might say.
Wait, hosted by who now? Who's doing that?
OpenAI created.
Oh, okay, right.
And they just licensed it to Microsoft, I understand. So it's GPT-3 is a breakthrough. It really is amazing.
Oh, okay, cool.
It's very impressive, but 175 billion, it's just a little hard to imagine. So I think I read a little piece today saying that the future was tiny ML, tiny machine learning, and I think there will be more attempts to accomplish something useful with smaller amounts of data. And related to that, we've got to get back to more transparent types of models. If we're going to trust these things and implement them in regulated industries, people are going to have to know how they work and
explainability.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Marco, your view of the future, what do you see, say, 5 years out?
A lot of cool things have been said. I would add a third dimension to this. I think we're going to have a third generation of data platforms out there. I think, generation one, I think we have very traditional systems that are primarily siloed, largely homegrown, hand assembled, I think as Miles was saying earlier. I think generation two is something that's much more centralized, big data lakes that are kind of running everything. And I think one of the big challenges with many of these data lakes is that once you're in, and you can see a lot of the stuff. One of the challenges that our friends at Facebook are having these days is that once you're into the data platform, you can see a lot of different things. And once you expose it to through an API, people can do all kinds of things with that data that you hadn't before anticipated them doing. And I think that the next generation of data platforms that I think that right now people are thinking hard about are going to embed much more, in a much more native fashion, things like differential privacy, for example, and having a much more systematic approach to thinking through issues around bias and so on. So they were going to be developing some of these tool sets to organize the data in a way where the access is much more nuanced than it's been in the past. And I feel that also as traditional companies come up to speed on this, as they are doing, they're much more thoughtful and conservative in many ways than digital native companies. They were tiny things just a decade ago. And so from that perspective, I think that what I'm hoping we'll see in 2025 is a lot more responsible data platform architecture and design. Not that right now everybody's being irresponsible, but we certainly have some room to grow, I think, in that domain, I would say. So hopefully.
Well, I'd say that issue of responsibility is really going to be a hot button issue. And it seems like it's idealistic to think it's going to get better because there's so much money to be made and not necessarily having it be better. Miles, are we going to be more responsible and more aware about how we use data 5 years from now? Or what's your take in the future?
Well, I'm worried. I did this book review about 2-3 weeks ago from, I think I'm going to say his last name, Aro, who's at MIT, who's written a very interesting book about how fake news transfers faster through the media than other things.
Yep.
And, I think we have to figure out how we have privacy. I think the other interesting thing, as somebody who loves the word segmentation is part of what's contributing to there being a lack of privacy and these echo chambers and things like that. So I think we've got challenges there. I think my hope is that, use, predictive analytics and, transform themselves digitally. But, one of the things that's really interesting, I don't know if Tom and Marco saw this, but we went from the year I was born, and I think Tom was roughly born, from 55 years for the life of an average public company to 20 a few years ago. And last year it dropped to 10.5 years for a public company.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the winners are really good at doing analytics and data and things like that. And so the legacy organizations have to figure out quickly how they're going to respond, or they may become irrelevant to the markets. I mean, do you, Marco and Tom, feel as worried about legacy companies?
I think so. I mean, there's some fascinating data by assembled by John Van Reenen at MIT, who looks at the increasing spread between firms, and he looks at labor productivity, which is one dimension, showing that over time the gap between the best and the worst in each individual sector of the economy is getting bigger. Now, labor productivity is just one dimension, but the similar analysis, I think, would reveal similar ideas across many dimensions, which is fundamentally the driver, I think, between the effect that, Miles, that you're looking at. And this differential between the digital haves and have-nots, I think, has become one of the defining characteristics of our society, and it works for companies, it works for people. We see it today, and again with COVID and the pandemic, it's become the difference between being in business and not being in business, or being able to work safely and not being able to work safely or at all. And I think those issues have become dramatic, and I think that as we hopefully by 2025, knocking on wood here, pick up from this pandemic, I think we'll see that some of the things that have changed as a result of it will stay different. And one of the things that I think will be different is that difference between firms and within firms sometimes. Like if you look at all the troubles that Amazon is having these days with sort of the digital workforce and the not so digital workforce, and not really agreeing on everything, is a major problem at the level of society, and it's already creating fragmentations and and all kinds of different challenges between people, organizations, regions, geographies, communities, ideologies, and so on. I mean, I think that's one of the drivers, right? So at the end of the day, even in politics these days, this whole sort of discussion is a major factor in the fragmentation that we're seeing in this country and beyond.
The discussion of haves versus have-nots, you mean?
Yeah, I know for sure. Like, so if I look at, if I look at Pennsylvania right now as one example, right? If you look at Western Pennsylvania, there's there's a lot of digital have-nots in that area of the country, and we can articulate sort of messages around the coal industry or whatever it is, but fundamentally, there's an increasing amount of resentment between sort of the parts of the country like that really have been left behind, and other parts of the country that are speeding along with, and doing multi-billion-dollar IPOs and things like that. And the equity differences are kind of hard to pave over, and I think they're driving challenges that we're going to see for many years to come. And so I think this is where we need to get creative, I think, in terms of figuring out ways to solve this, because I don't think that some of these problems are going to be easy to unwind.
Well, just on top of what Marco is saying, I think the whole gap that we have between people who seem to believe in science in this country and people who don't is echoed in believing in data and analytics and so on, and people who don't. And so, yeah, it's a big problem. And unless we do a better job of educating people and giving them the capabilities to learn about these things when they're young, I think we're going to continue to be screwed. There's no doubt we're screwed now. But
Tom, I think this, if I can add something to it just for 1 second, like one of my favorite case studies over the last year. I spent some time digging in with some friends at Mass General, right? Ancient hospital in Boston, 225 years old.
I was born there.
Here you go, Miles.
Way to go.
You and a few other folks. Amazing institution, right? It's ancient, U.S. Civil War, 225 years old, something like that. And they did an unbelievable job in analytics during the pandemic. And not because they had the fanciest possible data platforms or enterprise software or whatever it was, but just fundamentally because of what Tom said. They actually believed in the value of real analytics and the foundations of science. And they had models to predict, for example, N95 mask availability that they were sharing with all the other hospitals in the Boston area because they kind of figured this out. And it was just this beautiful story of this old institution with people that actually had strong beliefs in science that kind of drove digital transformation because they needed to, because they knew this thing was coming to them, and facilitated a much better outcome that would have been if they had gone into this blind, as many others did the same thing. And fundamentally, a lot of it does go back to fundamental beliefs, I think.
Mm-hmm. I read this report from the Rockefeller Foundation, and that I ended up interviewing one of the co-authors, and we talked about exactly this issue of the haves versus the have-nots, and this individual was optimistic that there would be some sort of a refereeing body, because in terms of the digital, the AI and analytics have and have-nots, without some sort of a refereeing body or an oversight body, it's hard to get real governance. I'm of the opinion that body will never really exist and will never really have power.
Well, I do see a big push for how do we establish and verify the data. So we hear everything from let's put all news stories in the blockchain so to verify that they came from real sources, and if it sounds too good to be true, you can go check and see if it's real. We're seeing lots and lots of data regulations springing up. GDPR in Europe, California now has their own data regulations, and so the ethical use of data, the trusting of what you actually have. These are going to be the great questions of our times. And you asked about what are we going to see 5 years from now? We're actually going to see a lot more regulation about what we can even do with data, what we're allowed to do with it, what we should do with it. And I've actually put it to all the CTOs of the top 4 technology companies. Shouldn't you guys have a leadership position because you're holding all of this data from all these companies around the world? I mean, the majority of the data in the world, in the business world, is in the top 4 platforms. And they don't want to touch that. They just don't feel that they should steward that. So we have a big leadership gap that government is probably going to step in and fill. And that that's probably not going to end up well, because non-technical people creating regulations around technology never seems to work very well.
No, but now we have the people in the current administration and in Congress who are really astute about these issues.
I sense a note of facetiousness.
Me, facetious? I would never do that.
Never.
Yeah.
But a lot of it is coming out of Europe right now, for sure, right? Letting the U.S. debate rest for a little bit. The amount of investment in this process in Europe is enormous, and they are starting the debate across data sciences, AI platforms, privacy, bias. And they're doing so, I think, and they've traditionally been pretty involved. I think they've amplified that, I would say, by a factor of 10 in the last 2 to 3 years, and we're going to see a lot more of that coming out of kind of that side of things. And there's some fairly technical people behind this, but still, these things are very hard to regulate. It really feels like we need to change the way that we think about regulation, or the kinds of design of regulatory bodies that can do this. Because, like, people say that most algorithms out there used in e-commerce are biased, but how would you even know? Right? How would you go out there and audit these and react to that? And would you have to get data on every single transaction by everyone to just evaluate whether or not they are complying to Title IX or whatever else?
And that's exactly what the regulators are going to insist upon, right? So GDPR already has basically made the lives of millions of business users very difficult by you can wave the regulator's wand. Now everybody has to do this, whether it's technically feasible or not. And so I do think we're going to very likely end up in a position where we do have to put many of our algorithms up for external scrutiny and verification. That those days may come.
And you should probably start now internally. I mean, Fidelity just established an algorithm review board, for example, and I think companies should have something similar.
But isn't one of the ultimate problems that a regulatory body and/or a governmental body would have circles run around it by private industry that has much deeper pockets and generally more expert people? I mean,
they'll gerrymander their way out of it. Yeah, exactly.
That's why I think we need to have real innovation here in some ways. That I would say, in a bit of a crazy way, the most impactful regulatory body ever conceived was the open source community in many ways, right? If you think about it. So, who really won the Microsoft case? It wasn't the US remedies, it wasn't the European remedies, it was the open source community creating an alternative that actually right now is much more widespread than than Windows, and the community as a whole is actually pretty active in all kinds of different things, including reviewing whether or not technology is built ethically or not, and it's a different way of thinking about regulation, I think. But I feel more comfortable about having something like that with some maybe regulatory guidelines than having necessarily a very traditional body, sit on a hilltop and proclaim validity or invalidity of certain things.
Right. I have a feeling this could be a 6-hour conversation, so I feel I better, say thank you to the four of you at this point, because otherwise we could be here for a while. But I want to give you back some part of your day. I definitely thank you for sharing your expertise. I'll send you the link when the video is edited and the podcast is ready. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care. All righty. Bye-bye.
Good job, everyone.